Hi everyone, my name is Ruth Warren. I have completed my master's degree in forensic psychology from National Forensic Sciences University, India. Now, I'm going to talk about methods and procedures interviewing. Despite the procedural differences between therapeutic and forensic assessment, there are also a number of similarities. Among them is the cornerstone of assessment, the clinical interview. Interviewing is the most frequently used method of assessment in psychology and consists of gathering information about an examinee by speaking directly to the examinee. A clinical um, a clinical interview is typically the initial approach used to gather information about a person because of the easy and depth of information that can be gathered. An interview might last anywhere from a half uh, hour to several hours. Clinical interviews normally consist of asking for personal information about different areas of the examinee's life such as family, work, mental health, substance use, education, or legal involvement. A forensic psychologist might ask a person if he had any difficulties in school with academics, peers, or disciplinary problems. She or he also might ask the person about his or her current feelings and thoughts. Is he or he having any difficulty performing routine tasks such as going to work, hanging out with friends and family, or performing household chores? No matter the specific question, there are three types of clinical interviews that fall on a continuum from unstructured to structured. In each case, there are certain advantages and disadvantages to using a single uh, to using single approach. Now, let's talk about unstructured interviews. In an unstructured interview, the forensic psychologist does not have a prescribed list of questions to ask but instead may have a general idea of the purpose of the evaluation or the areas to focus upon while gathering preliminary information. The forensic psychologist may simply ask about the reason for the evaluation and obtain background information that provides a context or explanation for the assessment. An unstructured interview probably looks very similar whether it is as part of a therapeutic assessment or a forensic assessment. Unstructured interviews are good for establishing rapport and gathering in-depth information. But because of the individual differences between psychologists, they may be more inconsistent. Establishing rapport means the psychologist and the examinee are able to get to know one another and that the psychologist is able to construct the situation in which the examinee will be open and honest. Nonetheless, it is important to establish rapport so that the examinee gives accurate information clearly, whether it is a therapeutic assessment or a forensic assessment. Unstructured interviews also allow the interviewers to follow up on any response and ask as many additional questions as the interviewer sees as appropriate. However, unstructured interviews tend to be less reliable in the information they elicit. The question, um, the question I ask of a given examinee might be very different from the ones another psychologist asks without a common script. Furthermore, the examinee may give different answers depending on their mood and the type of the report established by the psychologist. There is likely to be a great deal of variability in two different unstructured interviews. Now, let's continue to semi-structured interview. The first one before is unstructured interview. Now, number two is semi-structured interview. A semi-structured interview normally consists of predetermined questions that its interviewer follows, but also allows for some flexibility in answering those questions or additional follow-up questions. So let me give you an example that usually used in semi-structured interview. That is, um, we call psychopathy checklist revise, or usually uh, we call PCR. One step in administration of the PCR is a semi-structured interview, which is divided into general domains such as educational history, family history, occupational history, and so forth, with specific questions listed number under questions listed under each of those domains to focus the interview. In addition, there are suggested questions after each of these primary questions that an interviewer can ask if she or he chooses based on the examinee's initial responses. However, the interviewer is not required to ask each question or any of the follow-up questions. Semi-structured interviews may not be may not be as helpful for establishing a rapport as unstructured interviews, but they are generally more reliable across interviews and interviewers. Semi-structured interviews, like the one used with the PCLR, do not include questions focusing on informal conversational topic. I mean, do not include questions focusing on informal conversational topics such as the weather. Whether the examinee had difficulty finding your office, uh, or how he may be feeling on a given day. They are focused on getting answers to specific questions. Semi-structured interviews tend to allow for additional follow-up questions, so they are normally specified and they are more limiting than in unstructured interviews. In addition, semi-structured interviews allow for some consistency in questions asked of multiple examinees or across different interviews. The interview I give as part of the PCLR to my examinee will be similar, though not identical, to the interview that a colleague gives an examinee in some other part of the country. Now, let's continue to the last interview we call structured interviews. Structured interviews are the most formal and the most rigid types of clinical interviews. They consist of specific questions that must be asked by the interviewers, and the interviewer is usually not allowed to deviate from the prescribed questions. Structured interviews tend to have a specific purpose. For the example, the structured interview of reported symptoms, or SIRS second, consists of 172 questions that assess whether an individual is feigning or exaggerating symptoms of mental illness. The examinee is told that he or she must answer each of the questions with a yes or no response, while the interviewer does not ask any follow-up questions and avoid responding to any additional comments by the examinee during the interview. Obviously, these types of interviews are not the best if your purpose is to establish rapport. In fact, structured interviews could diminish your chance of establishing rapport if one of their use is an initial contact with with an examinee. Typically, a structured interview assigns points or identifies the item an examinee endorses to use in a formal scoring procedure. As a result, consistency and reliability of administration are of the utmost importance because scores are compared across different examinees um, as a basis of comparison. Again, none of the three types of the interviews is necessarily better than the another, but they each serve a different purpose. Each differs in terms of its ability to establish rapport, its allowance for follow-up questions, and the consistency or reliability of the interview itself. So that is my explanation about methods and procedures interview. And next meeting, I'm going to talk about methods and procedures psychological testing. Thank you so much for listening to my videos, to my presentation. Uh, then I'll see you next meeting. I promise to declare the truth. Bye bye.